I thought that I'd touch on one of the more complicated issues that we deal with, and one which people often struggle with. To look at, and I looked for a good thoughtful article about it, and I came across this, which is an older paper from the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, which is a review on an integrated literature review on existential suffering in the palliative care setting. These are common issues that we deal with, that they challenge palliative care providers, they cause severe patient distress, and they're often neglected because of confusion over definitions, sometimes a lack of conceptual understanding, a lack of documented interventions, and palliative care providers are often not well trained and don't feel well equipped to deal with it. The aims of this paper were to identify the palliative care literature related to existential suffering, looking at definitions, conceptual frameworks, interventions, and how palliative care providers care for patients with existential suffering. And they were looking for emerging themes, a critical review of those themes, to identify gaps in the research literature, and to recommend future research. So they set themselves a large agenda. They used keywords of existential suffering, existential distress, existential pain, and palliative care. They came up with 156 articles. 32% were peer-reviewed empirical research articles. 28 were peer-reviewed theoretical articles, and 14% were either reviews or opinion-based articles. And then they found 64 that were most relevant. And their report has 7 broad themes: the significance of the issue and end of life, definitions and conceptual understanding of the term, study designs used to investigate existential suffering, theories related to existential suffering, patient needs, perspectives of palliative care providers, and approaches to management, and these are the themes that we'll review, and I'm going to conclude with some practical observations for non-specialists in spiritual care. The primary goal of palliative care is to improve patients' quality of life through a comprehensive and compassionate approach to the alleviation of suffering. And suffering is a multidimensional phenomenon with physical, psychological, spiritual, and existential elements as part of it. And when one explores with people desire to live, or alternatively desire not to live, the major documented reasons for patients wanting to end their lives include issues like depression, isolation, hopelessness, fear of the future, fear of being a burden to others, and existential suffering. And I really think these terms like hopelessness, fear of the future, being a burden, these are all elements and isolation are all elements of what we'll see are elements of this existential distress. While the importance of the issue is well established, it's something which we really focus on in care planning. We focus very much on issues related to relieving physical symptoms, improving family supports, and there's really a strong focus on this element of engagement and care. They make the point that there's a paucity of research in how these issues are understood and managed in palliative care settings. They report that the terms spiritual and existential are very commonly used interchangeably in the literature. And they found more than 56 definitions of the term, some which were related and some were independent of spirituality. there are certain elements that had similar elements to spirituality: finding meaning, loss of meaning or purpose in life, finding an ultimate sense of wanting to find the answer of why am I here, what's the purpose of my life, and what will happen after I die. And other important themes which are independent of this of these spiritual things are things like connectedness, hopelessness, loneliness and isolation, issues of being a burden, and a terror of dying. And so saying here they're pointing out that some things seem to overlap with spirituality and some things are somewhat distinct from spirituality. And there are those who will conflate the issue, these terms, and those who separate them. There are lots of citations in this paper, and didn't have a chance to give all of the references. McGrath interviewed survivors with hematological malignancies, and the patients had a strong sense of being able to make a strong sense of importance of being able to make sense of their lives, or meaning of life, sense of connection with life. And these issues of meaning and connectedness can be threatened by breaks in relationships, a break in yourself, where a loss of physical identity, that I was once this father or mother who could do everything, who did the shopping, was a breadwinner, and now what can I do? I'm a shepherd cleat. And that this loss of sense of I'm not the same person as I was is one of the things that affects connectedness. And the other thing that threatens is relational losses, that the loss of relationships along the way with friends, or altered relationships with family. That I was once the person who was the carer, and now the cards are flipped, and I need to be cared for, and the challenges in adapting to that. I'm just going to try to get to change the screen here, because my images of you are somewhat obstructing my slides. Okay. Bill Mojo highlights that existential questions such as guilt, loss, anxiety, and fear of death are universal, and they can be quite separate from, or they're quite independent of any sort of religious commitments or religious belief systems. And in work that I did about 15 years ago with Craig Blinderman, who's now the head of palliative care at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, he did qualitative interviews with 40 of my patients, and we found that the key issues, existential issues, were very common, and this population distress was not. But the issues that people were concerned about were hopelessness, futility, meaninglessness, disappointment, remorse over decisions they had or hadn't made, death anxiety, and issues related to the disruption of personal identity. In the DSM, which is the formalization of psychiatric disorders, DSM obviously makes reference to symptoms of depression, anxiety, and anxiety disorders, but there's no explicit reference to existential pain, existential distress, or existential suffering. And even most recently, when David Kassane, who was formerly the head of psycho-oncology at Sloan Kettering, had developed and proposed and nominated the term of a demoralization syndrome, that was also not accepted as a distinct psychiatric illness or psychiatric condition. Morita, who was really the dominant player in Japanese palliative care, did a systematic review of all of the forms of psychological distress that are often considered to be spiritual or existential. And he came up with 13 categories. Meaningless in my present life, meaningless in my past life, loss of social role functioning, feeling emotionally irrelevant, dependency, being a burden or fear of being a burden on others, hopelessness, grief over imminent separation, questions related to why me, guilt, unfinished business, concerns about life after death, and concerns about faith. Can one make a distinguish between existential distress and psychological suffering? Or some people have proposed that people wanting death, had existential distress, but people who are depressed as well can just as much want to end their lives. So this does not affect, presence or absence of a desire for death is not a critical element here. Interestingly, and this is an interesting survey, Strang and his group, they interviewed chaplains, palliative care physicians, and pain specialists on the definition of existential pain, and each group defined the concept differently. Chaplains tend to stress issues around guilt. The palliative care physicians emphasized issues associated with annihilation and impending separation, and the pain specialists emphasize issues that the existential distress was associated with the sense that living is unbearably painful. The term existential anguish has been used to describing a fear of facing death, although the fear of facing impending death, or agony and distress arising from an unbearable state of existence. And I guess one of my early introductions to palliative care was where I looked after, as a young trainee in oncology, and just really began my career and interest in palliative medicine. And the former chief of nursing in my hospital was diagnosed with an advanced malignancy. And she had just an overwhelming sense of distress related to her impending death. And she was visited by her friend, who was a professor of nursing ethics from the United States. And after work with the chaplaincy service and with the psycho-oncologist, then she became an index case for me, at least, in the situation where we initially used, the only way she could have any sort of adequate relief or sense of relief was to have periods of time out and being sedated for initially for transient periods of time, to give her some degree of restfulness. This is an area of loose research. There are a few research studies that clarify the best way to care for people with existential suffering, what kinds of interventions are appropriate for individual concerns, and what are the appropriate frameworks concerning treatment. Also, there's been a lot of different study designs, randomized studies, case control methods, different quantitative designs. But overall, the impression is that the best way to evaluate existential suffering is with qualitative research, based on detailed interviews, and there are not a lot of studies in that area. The interviews with 40 patients that we carried out here in Israel. It was interesting. Initially, it was a struggle to get it published, And there was a lot of debate in palliative medicine as to whether to publish our paper or not, and they ultimately did. But it remains one of the relatively few larger studies of interviewing a large number of patients. So there's not a lot on interviewing dying patients about their existential suffering.
Personnellement, ces Américains, ils font même pas l'effort de présenter en hébreu.
C'est ça?
לא, סליחה, טעיתי.
There's not a lot about how palliative care providers address it, and how it's communicated and managed within the patient and caregiver encounter. And in North America, the research has largely focused on issues of hope, meaning, and dignity. I'd say they're the three, and we'll talk a little bit about meaning-based therapy and dignity-based therapies as a couple of lines of treatment that have been developed, as different approaches here. Theories related to existential suffering. There are a few empirical studies. There's a field of existential psychotherapy based on the work of Viktor Frankl and Irving Yalom. Viktor Frankl, who you may or may not recall, was a concentration camp survivor who observed how many people fell into ultimate despair and suicidality, and he observed that those people who managed to psychologically cope were people who could find a sense of meaning for their lives and for their survival. And when he, after he was liberated, he became a world famous psychotherapist, working on this meaning-based therapy. So his meaning-based therapy is called logotherapy, and it outlines that the broadest key existential issues for people are to find meaning in their life and possibly meaning in their death, a meaning for their suffering, the importance of love and connectedness, an emphasis on individuals have a choice in either to find meaning or not to find meaning, and this can be an active process. It's not like rehabilitation. It's not passively waiting until my strength recurs, but rather I need to actually work to re-establish meaning. And he, with an emphasis on what's important is not an action in and of itself, but the way the action is experienced, the intensity with which life is lived, and the notion has the ability to choose freely his or her responses to any given situation. And so a lot of this is work about appraisal. And an example was this, is that contrast the patient who is now, I had a patient today who's got far advanced metastatic prostate cancer, and with a lot of disease involving his pelvis and his acetabulum and acetabular instability, and he is wheelchair bound. And some patients will look at the wheelchair and say, look, what has my life come to? This is hardly worth living at all. And he looks at his wheelchair and says, oh, with a wheelchair I can get out. And the wheelchair is keeping me in life and keeping me engaged with my family and allowing me to live comfortably on a day-to-day basis. Irving Yalom, who was a great psychotherapist and author. Just for a moment. And author outlines 4 basic issues of the existential struggle: death, which creates anxiety; freedom, which involves choices, responsibility, and also the potential for guilt; isolation, and the ability to bridge isolation, and reconnect with others, and issues related to meaningless, which forces humans to seek or create personal meaning. So, and he engages issues of existential distress through getting people to deal with these to explore and to deal with these different issues.
He recently wrote a book about his wife, yes.
Yes, he did.
It was also published in Hebrew. Yeah.
There's also a wonderful recording of him being interviewed by Ben Korn on the Life Door website. And in his book, he talks about the experience and his observations of living and working through his wife's illness. The needs of patients with existential suffering. The literature about patients' self-reported needs is limited. Some of the themes that come out is the need to be in the presence of others and the need for connectedness. And Sand and Sprang conducted in-depth interviews with 20 patients and 20 family members, reporting that self-expressed loneliness was very common, not only amongst patients, but also amongst family members. That many people felt unable to share their thoughts and fears. And patients expressed feelings of existential loneliness when their bodies were not touched in an empathetic way. And this is a theme that comes out. So, particularly when doctors and other medical staff treat them from a distance without ever touching them or coming close to them. One of the themes that comes out is called skin hunger, and we explored in our group with our patients their preferences for therapeutic touch. So when a physician is talking to you, put a hand, and communicating something intimately, to put a hand on your shoulder or to hold your hand, how important is that to you? And about 40% of patients said that this sort of supportive touch was very supportive and very helpful to them. About 30% were indifferent, some 20% said it made them uncomfortable. And so I always offer a hand to patients, and you've got to read body language. In our study, what was interesting and counterintuitive was that when we broke it up by sex and religiosity, the group of patients that most strongly endorsed supportive touch were the religious women. And this came as a surprise to us. And when we debriefed them, they said that their needs for support and for this form of this sort of caring are no different to anyone else. And they felt that in a therapeutic relationship, they didn't need to ask their rabbi or anyone else about it, but it was a need that they had, and something which they appreciated. And I have found myself holding the hands of the wives of some of the biggest admorim in Jerusalem. The patients strongly appreciated the issue of presence. They did the time with the healthcare professional who will sit and make time to talk and take any personal interest in them. It can be a very powerful notion. And this, and this issue of presence was really quite important. Balfour Mount from Canada, exploring the inner life experience of existential suffering. He conducted the interviews with patients and found these four common themes: a sense of isolation and disconnection, meaning was evident in those able to find a sense of well-being and wholeness. Meaningless was common to those experiencing suffering and anguish, and different healing connections, healing with yourself, and in terms of dealings with things like healing issues of guilt and remorse and being able to talk through some of those things, and also to be able to express and define points of gratitude in your life, things that you've been grateful for. Healing with others, sometimes healing with the world and seeing your place in the world, and healing in terms of trying to see some sort of ultimate meaning to life. Again, this comes back to our study. We found, at least in our population, that a lot of people had existential concerns, but we found very people who were very distressed. And we thought that part of what mitigated the distress in our population was strong family bonds. That when people have strong family connections, this is a very, very powerful, important thing to help sustaining a sense of meaning and purpose, even as people are fading towards the end of life. Harvey Chochnov has developed a patient's dignity inventory. They felt there was a need for a self-report instrument with relevance to explore a variety of sources of distress facing patients with imminent distress. And patients report on factors of existential distress, reporting such issues as not feeling worthwhile, not being able to carry out important roles, feeling life has no meaning, and the same. These are becoming recurring themes. How palliative care physicians or clinicians, not just physicians, respond to existential suffering, and how do they cope with it? In one qualitative study of 10 physicians concluded that the physicians were very vulnerable confronting life and death issues, and that this has been underestimated, and the physicians also need to belong to a caring community, and this and support from others was an important part of dealing with their loneliness and sometimes sense of powerlessness in the front when confronting the suffering, the severe suffering of patients approaching the end of life. A qualitative study of Swedish nurses in hospices and oncology wards. They examined the levels of stress in nurses responding to existential suffering. Nurses' stress levels were multifaceted and related to their own death anxiety, and many nurses perceived that they didn't have the tools to be able to relieve or address these issues. And there's another group of studies from focus groups in palliative care settings. Found that people had no general solutions to the care of these patients, that palliative care physicians professionals didn't feel well trained in issues related to autonomy, meaning, guilt, dignity, and communication about existential issues. And few felt well trained in the treatment of existential pain. Often there was an opinion that these issues fell under the category of the chaplain or clergy, and they felt that they often didn't have time to be able to give the time that these issues needed. So there's an issue of both training and time availability, because understanding that these issues do take time. And that when palliative care clinicians lacked skill in these things, this sometimes exacerbated the situation for patients. When patients were left alone and treated disrespectfully in a way that made them feel invisible, when staff avoided contact, this exacerbated existential distress, and this was what the patients described as skin hunger. When the term the patients used in this study, when their bodies were touched disrespectfully. So the issue of body language, the doctor that's standing at the end of the bed with his arms crossed is a way which closes out relationships and does not invite people in. How people are handled when they're being washed or bathed or taken to bathrooms or brought back to bathrooms, attention to keeping their gowns closed, are they being exposed? All of these sort of things can, and the way in which they're done, it can either enhance or diminish people's sense of self-worth and value. Again, this recurring theme, poorly defined, neglected symptom of suffering, little known about efficacy of interventions. Because of there's a lack of conceptual understanding, there's often confusion as to how to treat this. Challenges of assessing and treating as existential domains. Lack of clarity of a clear theoretical framework. A recurring theme. And I'm going to just touch on a couple of different strategies that have been more constructively proposed. Michael Carney, who is an Irish palliative care physician, talks about the psychotherapeutic response to suffering and soul pain, and he distinguishes between surface work and deep work. Surface work is stuff about doing and concrete conscious acts of trying to alleviate pain and discomfort. And depth work he describes as any approach or intervention that might bring an individual to experience their soul, to be able to reconnect with simple aspects of life that have brought them depth and experience and significance. And the examples that he brings about encouraging people to talk about important memories, to talk about their important relationships and the loves in their lives, and for some people, going and visiting a special place of personal meaning. And on this latter one, I just, many of you will know that I recently came back from Australia, where I'd gone to be with my father for his 90th birthday. And my dad is an elderly, now retired physician, and who had recently been in and out of hospital with sepsis. And when I arrived there, he was still in a rehabilitation hospital. What had prompted me to come was when he'd said to me on the 11th of May, 30 days of September, April, June, and November, all I've got to do is to get through 30 more days. And on the day that he was discharged from the rehabilitation hospital, my brother and I put him in the car and we took him out to the beach 100 kilometers from Melbourne, which is the place that we had holidayed as children every year for over about 20 years with all of us as kids, and also with my late mother. And just the simple act of walking together along the pier over the quiet water in a place which was so full of memories for all of us had a disproportionately rejuvenating power over him. We sometimes see this also with patients where we use the resources of the Make-A-Wish ambulance, ambulance of Michelot, where we take patients who are approaching the life out to places that are important to them, that this sort of thing can often help to reconnect them with a sense of who they have been and things that have been important to them. The importance of obtaining a clinical biography, I can't underestimate, understate the importance of just sometimes sitting with patients and understanding their life story. Because by reconnecting patients to who they have been and emphasizing that they are still they are still that same person, that is a very powerful tool in and of itself. It often helps people to reconnect with the fact that yes, my life has had meaning and has had value, and often to reconnect people with what are the things from their life that they would like to share either with their children, grandchildren, or children not yet born who will want to have known who they were. Many of you will be familiar with the approaches of Harvey Churchill of dignity conserving therapy, and this is a therapy based on engaging the patient in a structured interview where they're asking a series of different questions about their life, and about the important activities in their life, loves in their life, achievements in their life, disappointments in their life, and then collating that into a presentation or book that you can give back to the patient and then review with them. And this has been found to be quite a potent tool in improving patients' sense of meaning and connectedness, and which can be done either formally or using some of these ideas in an informal basis. Balfour Mount, who is a wonderful, very sensitive palliative care physician, lists a range of different strategies to identify sources of meaning, both positive ones and negative ones, before and during the patient's illness, exploring the creation of a life narrative and important legacies that they would want to leave for loved ones, exploring sources of what are the things that cause them distress, that cause them distress before in their lives and that cause them distress now, asking people about their dreams and some sort of clues to the sorts of things that have brought them joy or bring them distress, asking them about what are the connections that have been helpful in getting them through their illness experience, minimizing uncertainty as much as possible, or sometimes I would even say confronting uncertainty to say, look, there is uncertainty, but if there are changes, I will let you know what is happening. Identify fears and allow people to verbalize their fears. Identify defense mechanisms that are making patients more distance, or enhance things that can bring them to closeness with others. Promoting a calming atmosphere characterized by efficiency, accompaniment, non-abandonment, and caring, and to promote strategies that bring the person into their present moment and focusing on the now, such as music, meditation, or just engaging them in discussions about the things that are interesting to them. My daughter has watched too much of Grey's Anatomy, and she sometimes says to me, Dad, what sort of doctor are you? You don't operate, you don't do procedures, you just talk to people. And but that talking to people and engaging and building a therapeutic relationship, that therapeutic relationship becomes part of the tools of helping people address many of these issues. As part of this issue of legacy, the projects, people do projects of making recordings about their lives, and in this time with mobile phones, it's very easy for people just to turn it on, even just to tell a brief story and just collect these recordings, because this will be a meaningful and possibly important legacy for people who will not yet know them. And again, coming back to my dear 90-year-old dad, my mother died 22 years ago, and to this day, my father sits and listens to recordings that she made, which she used to send to my brothers and I when we were overseas, just talking about her day-to-day life in the 1970s. But these recordings of hearing her voice and now allow him to reconnect. And that was an important legacy that you can empower patients to leave for their loved ones. And again, that creates a sense of purpose. There is even a research study on reflection on steroids. This is giving a dose of a moderate dose of corticosteroids to patients with hopelessness, deterioration, and diminished autonomy, and yes, the burst of energy that can give, particularly towards the end of life, can give a sense of a transit, at least normalized life, symbolizing hope, health, hope, and autonomy. And I've certainly used this strategy not uncommonly with people coming towards the end of life, or particularly if they have major life events towards the end of life that they would like to be able to have the strength to participate in. Palliative sedation is not very much an option of last resort. In a situation of overwhelming existential distress at the end of life, normally we would only use it in patients after giving them a respite from multiple, and if they often just having respite and time out is enough people to regather back their energies. But they're increasingly.
להתעמת עם התרגום כל הזמן.
סליחה? So often patients will have, some patients who, we use this very, very infrequently, but if so, we would only give people some time out to start with. And if they have persistent, severe existential distress every time they wake up, then very rarely we have used this on a continual basis. But I would say in our last 25 years here, we have used this maybe 3 or 4 times. So I just want to finish with 2 strategies that I find that all palliative care clinicians can use on a day-to-day basis. And these are what I call purposeful observations and purposeful conversations. And at the end of a visit with a patient, I will often talk to them about how lovely it is to see the relationships that they have with their family, and what that says to me, to see people loving them, the impact that they've had on other people's lives. I will say something about their courage, or about their coping, or to say how much I admire them for what they have done in their lives, or even if it's just to say how grateful I feel that they're prepared to give me trust. Again, these are just sometimes small observations to say something positive and encouraging, which is relevant. I don't like saying Yetov or Al Tidag or Kol Yeh Beseder, because it's not going to be Beseder, and Lo Yetov. But to find something positive to say about the person and who they are. And to find time for sometimes exploring with people about issues, about Emunah Shalem, מה היו הדברים שהביא אותם בחיים, ה-values שלהם, מה היו הפחדים בעבר ומה הפחדים עכשיו, איך הם מעריכים איכות החיים, ומה זה הדברים החשובים ביותר להם בקשר לאיכות החיים, ההבנה שלהם בקשר להבחנה ופרוגנוזה, איזה טיפולים זה, הם רואים כטיפולים סבירים או לא סבירים, ומה הם היו רוצים, איך הם היו רוצים לראות את סיום החיים שלהם. וזה לא שיחות ברגל אחד, וזה שיחות בעיניים, ובמקרים רבים בפרטיות או עם אווירה של אינטימיות. ואני מנסה להזכיר לאנשים, לזכור מה הדברים הטובים שהיו לי בחיים, to be forgiving גם של עצמם וגם האחרים מסביב, לפעמים לכבד את השקט, ולא צריכים תמיד לדבר, לפעמים זה פשוט מספיק לשבת ביחד או להחזיק את היד. להכיר שהמצב הזה זה מאבק מטייף, גם לעצמי לנסות לחבר או למצוא חיבור עם הפציינט, וגם לעזור להם לחזק את החיבורים החשובים להם, אם זה עם משפחה או חברים מיוחדים, כי זה בין הדברים שמוציא אותנו מה-existential loneliness הזה, שרק אני יכול להרגיש מה שאני עובר פה. לעבוד על עניין לזרום, to be like water, כי יש דברים שמשתנים שאין דרך לעצור אותם לגמרי. למצוא את הדרך להתגמש, כי מי שחוסר גמישות, זה אינו מפסיק את הזרם, זה רק מקשה את הדרך. וביחד לנסות למצוא איזשהו ערך ומטרה לזמן הזה שיש. וכמו כושר זה לא רק דבר שנופל מהשמיים, זה דבר שעלינו לראות איך אנחנו יכולים למצוא את הערך עם הזמן שיש. אז תודה רבה.